Okay, so hello and a warm welcome to CSE Digital. It's the new digital presentation format of the Comic-Salons Erlangen, which this year, unfortunately, due to the pandemic, had to be canceled. And a number of guests of honor that we would have liked to visit, to welcome here in Germany. Now we are meeting instead online at CSE Digital. So I'm very happy at this moment to be connected through video with Seth in Canada. So hi Seth, how are you?
Good, how are you doing?
I'm fine. How are you holding out over there in this unusual time?
Well, as I'm sure if you've talked to other cartoonists, you'll find out that not much has changed in the life of a cartoonist.
Yeah.
You stay home all the time anyway.
Yeah.
The biggest change that's happened in my life is that my wife, who owns a barbershop, she had to shut down the barbershop for about 3 or 4 months. So she was in the house all the time.
Yeah.
That was the big shift that occurred.
Yeah. Okay, but cartoonists are working at home on their own and are sort of by nature almost hermits anyway, I guess.
I got kind of used to having her here. Now she's gone back to work. I miss her.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk a bit about that because it affects everyone here, of course, and it affects a lot of the events that we would have liked to welcome you. We would have liked to welcome you as the guest of honor at the Comic-Salons Erlangen, maybe at the Frankfurt Book Fair as well. So I'm even happier that at least this way we can meet here. And just by way of introduction, I mean, most people who are following us here probably know you and know your work. But for the people who are just tuning in right now, you are definitely one of the most outstanding illustrators and comic artists, cartoonists, visual storytellers in North America. And you've published a number of books that we have partly also published in Germany, like this book, for example, It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken, was published in Germany. We have a number of your other graphic novels, comic collections that came out in German as well. And this year in Germany, we'll see the publication of your so far largest work, Clyde Fans, a book of nearly 500 pages. And I just spoke to your German publishers yesterday at Edition 52. They're in the process of transferring it to German, working on the translation, the lettering, and so on. So later this year, it will come out. And I'm very happy that now finally it can be read as a whole story, because I've been basically one of the followers that bought one issue of Palukaville after another, your serialized comic publication in which a lot of these stories came out in the first place. And now it's a wonderful experience to see it all together and in one coherent story. So Seth, let me ask you a question. How does it feel to you after 20 years of working on this story and now finishing it up with this book? Is it a big relief, or is it also sad to let the characters and the story go?
Well, before I answer that question, I'm going to mention that you're one of the rare characters or rare readers that was around for the whole experience. Now, when I started Clyde Fans, I imagined it would take about 5 years. So I didn't see it much different as the way I did like the book before it. It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken. But by the time we got to 10 or 15 years, I stopped thinking about who was reading the book in a way, because I figured people like you that were still picking up those issues were like the rare individuals who were paying attention to this story. It took so long that I just stopped assuming anyone understood what was going on. And in fact, I don't think I talked about Clyde Fans to anybody in person, like very much at all, for at least the last 10 years I worked on the book. Most people couldn't remember what had happened between episode to episode. It was, you can't read a story over 20 years. But to answer your question, once I got to the point where it was done, it's funny. I mean, at around the last few years before I finished it, I didn't want to talk to people about it because I felt strange that it had taken me so long to make this book. I felt kind of guilty. I felt a bit embarrassed, like, why did it take so long? And in fact, if people asked me about it, if they rarely asked me about it, I would always kind of get away from the question. I would say something brief like, oh yeah, I'm working on it. But when it was done, suddenly my feelings about the book changed. I think it had been kind of hanging over my head as like sort of an albatross for a long time, hoping I would finish it up and worried that maybe I would die before it was done. So when it was done, not only was I relieved, I was very relieved that it was finished, but I also suddenly I felt like reconnected to the book in a way. I felt strangely an affection for it that I think had disappeared in the last 5 or 10 years because it was a task. It had to be done. Now I feel good about the book. I feel I'm grateful I did it. I'm glad that I didn't abandon it. And I think it'll probably end up being like my signature work. So I'm glad it's over, but I do still feel good about the book.
Yeah. It's a book I'm just quickly going to summarize for people who might not know the story yet and who are still about to discover it, that tells us about the lives of two brothers, older brothers, who are looking back at their lives. So it's a lot about memory and recollection of what happened in one's life, dreams, aspirations, failure. It's about progress. These two brothers inherit a fan shop, and then you experience with them how modern times basically steamrolls over them. And then it becomes sort of this journey into their different memories and into a sort of partly even a dream-like world and partly just memories of real life. And I'm wondering, when you look at these two brothers, they represent two very different concepts of men at the time. One is sort of the man who lives away, a man who's supposed to live a life back in the days, middle of the 20th century and the following years. The other one is much more a recluse, maybe an artist who just didn't have a chance to live it out. And in a lot of your work, like It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken, for example, you used obviously autobiographical reference. Here it's much more fictional, but to what extent do you still feel like these characters also represent certain times in your life maybe, or certain sides of what you've experienced in life?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the oldest answer in the world, but it's very true that the characters are myself. I mean, they're different aspects of myself. You've got two characters, one who is very outgoing, or at least one who's an extrovert, and one who's an introvert. I feel like these are the obvious two sides of my own personality. I'm a very extroverted person. I mean, I'm not a shy person. I'm social, but I spend most of my life alone. It's the cartoonist lifestyle that, you spend all your time sitting in a studio by yourself. I'm most comfortable by myself. That schism between like the outside world and the interior reality of like, the inner life you have. I feel like this is something I'm always writing about. And certainly these two characters represent those two sides. I've parceled off certain elements of my life to one or to the other characters. Abraham is the rougher character. Like when he talks about like, his sort of like, his rough dealings with women or his abusive kind of behavior. I mean, these are taken, of course, from incidents in my own life too, where I've shifted events to use as fodder for these kind of characters. If I'm talking about Simon's relationship with his mother, I mean, these are obviously taken from myself too. I mean, I can go through the book very easily and see like what this is and what that is and where they come from. But there's also another kind of odd quality that happens when you're writing fiction, and that's that even though these things are all taken from you, they change when you put them down on the page. They turn into something, you're freed from the reality of like talking about what really happened or who you really are, to somehow it makes it, I feel like it gets truer in some strange way. There's something about writing autobiography that makes you constantly be fudging things in a way. Like I'm writing my own biography right now, this memoir called Nothing Lasts. And I feel like in some ways it might be more fiction than Clyde Fans is, because you're very careful how you control talking about actual events in your life, how other people are dragged into it, how you want to present yourself. It gets to be much more of a performance in a way than when you're writing fiction. Fiction allows you to just sort of open a spigot and let things flow out. I think that's why I kind of stepped away from autobiography.
Yeah, I see. In the book, one can also see a few photos of a real life store facade that existed in Toronto in up to the 1990s, I think.
Yep.
and even some items that I assume are from that store. Are these objects from the real Clyde Fans, or are they partly fictional?
No, they're fake.
They're
I just
fake.
faked. Okay. Yeah, we faked those up. I do have some real items from the store. I have a couple of the fans. I have some catalogs and things. I have a calendar, but these two particular items are just made up fakes.
Oh yeah, okay, good. And one topic is also in the book, perseverance, how these characters just carry on even though they're facing a lot of obstacles and a lot of challenges. And perseverance is also something that came to my mind when I read the book now, and was trying to imagine how it must have felt working through it all over those years, because you had a lot of other projects in between that kept you busy enough, I'm guessing. So how many times were you thinking of giving up and had to sort of pull yourself back to the drawing table for this?
To be honest, I never considered giving it up because my working methods are kind of well suited to a long project like this, I've realized. I like to plod along on things. I move in a slow way. I have a lot of different projects going at the same time, but I never work like in a long sustained period for like, I jump around from things. So I have like my imaginary city that I'm working on in my notebooks. I'll work on that for a couple of weeks. I'll get excited about it. And then I'll grow tired of that and I'll start working in the sketchbook on some of my comics I'm working there. Then I might go back to whatever like comic I'm working for the next Palookaville. And then I've got commercial work. So it's kind of all over the place. And I think back when I started Clyde Fans, I didn't realize that this was how my working methods were. I think then I thought I would be like much more like I will just sit down and finish this book over a period of time. And what I always tell people is when I say like I worked on this for 20 years, obviously I didn't work on it every day for 20 years. I worked on it for a few months every year. Exactly. And that's why it took so long. If I'd sat down and worked on it full time, I probably could have finished it up in 5 years.
Yeah.
But now I realize like that's just the way I work. And so there's something kind of satisfying to having a project that you just keep coming back to. I think one of my biggest problems in life is I keep making these big, long projects that don't really have an end in sight. Like my imaginary city Dominion, it's like that sort of thing where I stopped making the cardboard buildings at some point when I got to 100 of them. But the history of the city keeps going on, and I realize there's nowhere really to stop that. I have other projects like that too, where I feel like they just go on forever. And in a way, that becomes a problem because then you get too many things that go on forever. You can't do 100 projects that never end. So I do have to try and force myself to be more focused occasionally.
Yeah. Dominion is a good keyword for something I would like to closer look into. Locations, specific locations that you create or recreate in your work. And I've experienced that since I come to Canada quite frequently, since my wife's from there. Whenever I go through Ontario towns and cities, repeatedly I have these moments where I feel like, oh yeah, this is like a Seth street. This is like a Seth building. This is like a Seth neighborhood. And you've created a certain amount of fictional, but partly real city life of Toronto, partly Dominion, the fictional city. So I'm wondering, in this book, Clyde Fans, there are some references that to me look like, yes, this is real Toronto. And then there are other parts where it's more a fictional city or somewhere in between. Where do you locate these places between reality and your imagined world?
Yeah, when I started Clyde Fans, I hadn't really invented Dominion yet. My stories at that point were taking place in Toronto. Good Life, It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken takes place in Toronto, and then it takes place in a couple of other small Canadian cities or towns. And even though they're not remarkably accurate, they were set in the real world. Somewhere in Dominion, I guess around the second chapter, in Clyde Fans, when he goes to the city of Dominion, I just sort of pulled that name out of a hat. I needed a place for him to go. And I didn't want it to be anywhere specific. I can't remember my logic anymore, but I just named it Dominion. And somewhere in the years that followed that took on another quality of what I would call like a kind of quintessential Canadian city. And I sort of everything that's Canadian in my experience, or at least English Canadian, Ontario, kind of got poured into that imaginary city. So I would say like a big part of it is honestly just the simple fact that you can't help but produce work that is about where you live. When I lived in Toronto, my work was more urban than it is since I moved to Guelph. A couple of years ago, somebody said to me, they said that my work was all about like the countryside. And I hadn't really thought about it. And then I realized, oh yes, I guess I mostly draw rural images now. I draw small towns, or I draw rolling hills and farmland. And it kind of happened without planning it. And I think that's just because you end up reflecting, where you are. I think my work when I lived in Toronto was very much about the urban landscape. And now my work is much more about the rural sort of small town landscape.
Yeah.
And I don't think I made it a conscious choice to say, like, I really want my work to reflect this. I think it just crept in bit by bit. And that world of the post-war Ontario, like which I grew up in, basically, I think is so deeply embedded into my psyche that it would have come out no matter what. At this point, I'm pretty aware that I'm doing it, but I do think it crept in sort of by accident.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that City of Dominion and the Cardboard City and things like that a little more in detail in a few minutes. But first, I would like to pick up on what you said on how the locations evolved over time, because my impression is that Clyde Fans, now the collected Clyde Fans, very nicely shows an evolution in many ways. There is an evolution in terms of the drawing style. Like here we see one of the earlier images. And then when you look at one of the later images, the line work is much more like thicker, darker, partly even more abstract, I would say. So that I find quite amazing as well, how obviously it evolved over time. And I think it's beautiful to see it because the book is about the passing of time, but you can also actually see the passing of time, which took place during the creation of the book. So I'm wondering if you were from the beginning okay with this, because sometimes when artists put together something that they've worked on for decades, they are not quite happy with how it looked in the beginning, because of course they have evolved, but at the same time, I think it's a beautiful quality here.
Well, yeah, you're right. I was not okay with it. But there was nothing I could do about it. It's like I was aware, even by like halfway through the book, that the book would never have a kind of cohesiveness that I would have preferred. I knew when I got to the end that I certainly could have sat down and started redrawing the book again, but that would have been a crazy plan, because by the time I got to the middle of the book again, it would be all wrong again. The work evolves without even being able to control it. In fact, I went back and of course fixed up certain things in the earlier art. But when I went back to the very first chapter, I found I literally could not fix any of the artwork because I couldn't draw like that anymore. I couldn't even fake it. There was a couple of panels where I wanted to change, like I was unhappy with the compositions of them. There were some strange bad choices made. So I tried to, redraw them and then re-ink them in the old style. And it's like, it was impossible. They stood out like a sore thumb. So the best I could do was I took them and I Xeroxed certain elements from them and like cut them up and changed them around a bit so that I could squeeze those old drawings back into a slightly better form. And at that point, I just said to myself, this book will be what it is. I mean, I will fix what I can, but I will allow the reality of, of how it came together to exist. There's really nothing else I could do about it. And I came to terms with it. But obviously, if I could have magically transformed all the artwork so that it was more cohesive, I would have. I think it's pretty true that artists in general always think their work is getting better. So like the drawings at the end of the book are much more appealing to me than the drawings at the beginning. The problem, of course, is artists aren't always the best judge of their own work. So you never really are aware when the point changes from when the work is getting better to when it starts to decline. I think it's kind of inevitable for most artists, not everybody, but most. There's a period where the art starts to get worse, but you don't see it. I mean, I've read many interviews with old cartoonists and they'll say like, I'm doing the best work of my life right now. And I'll think to myself, no, you're not. But they can't see it because it's their own work. So you do worry about that evolution in your work, whether it's always going upward or whether you're hitting the plateau or when you're hitting the point where you're heading down. But I will say I'm happiest with where, like, the work has changed tremendously. And like you said, it's moved to a much more graphic, a much almost more abstract form. And I'm more comfortable with that now than the more illustrative style I was doing in the beginning.
And another thing that I find fascinating is that you can also see an evolution of the kind of storytelling you're using. In the beginning, there's a much more reality-based approach. We have like 100-page-long monologue by Abe in the beginning who talks about salesmanship and salesman's tricks, and it sounds like very much rooted in the reality of a salesman. And then later, also mostly through the experiences of Simon, but also just, I guess, by your sheer storytelling, things become much more filled with imaginary elements. The writing, to a certain extent, becomes more poetic, I would say. And there's much more of a dreamlike quality. Symbolism becomes more important. How much of the story as such and the writing was planned from the beginning, or did also the story and the writing evolve, and did you actually write it while you were working on it?
Yeah, it's a funny thing to explain, like, because certainly the way I work, and I think the way a lot of cartoonists work, is that the word writing is a strange term because much of the writing is the drawing. Mm-hmm. So it's like the story was certainly entirely planned out like that before I even started the first page. I knew everything that would happen in it, and nothing happened in the story that wasn't planned in those early days. So even like exactly the last line of the book is where the book ended. And I knew that's where it would end 20 years ago. But that doesn't mean I sat down and wrote the book out 20 years ago. What I did was I, of course, made tons of notes. And then as it went along, you write the book as you draw the book. So I knew what the dialogue, I knew that there was like a scene coming at some point where these toys that Simon had would represent kind of an imaginary world that he was in. That I knew that day was coming, and I was waiting for it, and I knew what would happen when it got there. And then when I did that scene and published it, that's a particular scene where I later decided it was a mistake. It didn't work right. And so then, like 10 years later, I went back and changed that scene, removed all the dialogue from the talking toys and stuff, and fiddled around with it. So little changes did happen. There were things where I was like, this was a mistake, or this didn't work. Or by the time I got to it, I found a better way to tell that story. But the actual events were very straightforward. I knew exactly what would happen. What really changed over time was how I told the story. Mm-hmm. So in the beginning, I was working in a kind of approach which I call like the naturalistic approach, which is much like the way a film operates. You watch a character and you follow them around sort of as if you're an invisible ghost, and everything they do, you follow them around and watch them and listen to them. But by the end of the story, I was working in a much more distant style, I'd say, where things had become more graphic. I was more concerned with like how you were reading the story. It was more controlled in a different way. I'd always known I was going to change like a certain kind of narrative approach as I was going through, because each chapter has its own narrative style. But I think the way I broke down a page, the way I asked you to like look at the characters, the way I asked you to navigate through the pages really changed over 20 years. There's a kind of natural, I've always been interested in simplicity in like images. And I think over 20 years, my desire to simplify the images and how a story is told just got more and more simple. And in fact, even since Clyde Fans, I feel like my work has gotten even simpler. I've been working on some strips lately where I feel like everything is just silhouettes or like very simple drawings of buildings. I feel like I'm getting down to the point where I can barely draw anything.
Yeah, and we will look at a few of those in a minute, because some of these newer works were on display last year at one of the two big museum shows where your work was featured in Canada. I'd just like to use this aerial shot as a bridge to entering one of the shows with our audience here. There was a large exhibition that was dedicated to your work at the Art Gallery of Guelph, your hometown in Southern Ontario. And the key piece of the exhibition was a stunning collection of the 100 cardboard buildings that you mentioned earlier, Dominion. This is just a breathtaking collection of work. And I'm just wondering, where did you keep all these before they ended up in the museum exhibition?
Well, for a long time, I had a room that I kept them in when there was less than 50 of them, I think, and I had shelves for them. But at that point, they were just being made to be in that room. After the first time I exhibited them at the Art Gallery of Toronto, the AGO, the first time I showed them, then I sort of changed how I thought about them. Then I realized that they weren't just a private project. They'd turned into a kind of an art form of their own, or an artwork of their own. At that point, I started to continued to make them, and there were too many of them. So then that's when I got a storage unit, like every other artist, and just put them in boxes and stored them away. And that's where they are now. I mean, originally they were meant for me to display. They were part of a process. But now I do think of them, I guess, more as an installation.
Were they also reference material in the beginning? Because when we look at them in detail, I guess we can see a lot of the buildings and corners and how buildings stand in relationship to another, the way you do it in your graphic novels. So what's this partly?
I never used them as a drawing aid or as a planning tool in the real sense. How they really came about was really quite simple. Around the time I was working on Clyde Fans, I was also kind of thinking of another graphic novel I was playing around with an idea of that would have 5 short stories that were only linked by the fact that the characters lived in the same place. And so that's around the time that I was inventing Dominion, and I thought it would be good to have a chapter at the beginning of this graphic novel where I gave the history of this place they lived. And I thought I won't be working on this for quite a few years because I was going to do it after I finished Clyde Fans. So I thought to myself, well, how do you make up the history of a town or a city? And I thought, well, you could just, say like in 1832, a pioneer came out of the bush, and you could just start at the beginning. But I thought it would be more interesting if I allowed it to develop organically. So I thought I'll just make up something that's in this town, some business or home or something. And then I'll make up more of them. I'll write them down in a notebook and figure things out. And then over time, I thought they'll connect and a history will start to be formed. So while I was working on the first couple of these little businesses I was making, I decided to make a little cardboard building just for fun. It's the kind of thing I like to do as a child. And so I thought it would be fun to do because it would also give me time to think about the business while I was making it. And after I made 1 or 2 of them, I just liked them. I just thought it was a neat thing to do. And so I thought I'll keep doing this. And that became a kind of an offshoot from this graphic novel project. Eventually, I lost interest in that graphic novel. But I continued on with that history of the city because it seemed interesting to me. And as I worked on it, and I've been working on that for about 20 years now too, it did all follow that plan. Things did start to connect, but they didn't connect as fast as I originally planned. I think it took about 10 years of making things up before real connections started to form, where I started to see where figures rose up out of this imaginary story and became important in the history of this place. Different financiers, different historical people, different mayors, whatever. Then they started to come together. And then a few years after that, I started to get a much broader sense of the city. And then at the 20-year mark, I feel like things have remarkably come together. I really know this place much, much better than I did even 5 years ago. Yeah. Somehow there is a kind of an organic system that develops where things start to connect. Streets come together, people come together, histories come together. And now I feel like it's become quite a rich project that is a project in itself. I no longer think of it as research for something else. I don't know what it is. Like these notebooks they are the final form, I think, now.
Yeah, because when you refer to notebooks in the exhibition, we saw some of the notebooks. I think these are the ones you're referring to, where an imaginary visitor enters the city and talks about how he walks through it. So this, I guess, is the project that you were working on for a while, but then abandoned, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, by this point, that project was long abandoned. But this is like an ongoing process of anything that strikes me about the city, I will just start writing about it, sometimes in comics form, sometimes in written form. So right now I'm working on like some of the 19th century history of the city. But as soon as this is done, I'm almost done this big 50-page chapter I'm working on. I'm going to start writing about some of the natural history of the place, some of the plants and some of the animals that live around in the environment. And it's not because there's a natural reason to do it. It's just that's what's my fancy at the moment. Yeah. Later, that will have some importance because somehow or other, it always ties in again. There'll be a point where, like, for example, years ago, I was asked if I could make like a parade float for a parade about in Niagara region that was about the wine industry. Now, I don't have any connection to the wine industry except I like to drink it. And so I decided, well, what's the wine industry in Dominion? And I started making up this history of wine there. And then I made a big float that was connected to that. Well, now all that stuff about wine that I made up, that stuff entered into other elements of the city. And now I know like how that connects to different taverns, different, whatever. It all sort of, every little thing you make up, even if it seems completely arbitrary, somehow ends up informing something else in the imaginary history. And I think that process is what I'm more interested in than any final result. So mm-hmm. At this point, there's tons of stuff, but it's not, it doesn't have a logical history to it.
Yeah, the parades also play a role in some of these sketchbook notes that were on display in the exhibition. And another mm-hmm. thing that I found really fascinating was to see a bit of your work process in the exhibition. We could have looks into your sketchbook and another item, I'm not too sure to what extent that ever really materialized into a published project, was stamps you created. So maybe you mm-hmm. could elaborate a tiny bit on this project for people who have not seen these before.
Yeah, this is like many years ago. I think this might be about, 10 or 15 years ago. I was talking with the other cartoonist, Ivan Brunetti, on the phone, and we were talking about how valuable it is to keep a diary. But both of us were complaining that we'd always done a poor job of keeping a diary going. It's hard to keep a diary going. You miss a few days and then you feel you got to fill it in and then you don't get around to it. And then eventually a week has gone by and then eventually a month and then you give up. And we were both also lamenting that we would love to keep a comic strip version diary. I think Chris Ware at that point was already doing a very elaborate comic strip diary every day. And Chris is so disciplined. We were both jealous of him. And then I think I just jokingly said to Ivan, well, you could just get some rubber stamps made up and just stamp them and write in the dialogue. And I was offering this as a suggestion to him. But the minute I said it, I realized, well, that's a good idea. And I said to him, you can't have that idea. I've changed my mind. That's for me. So then I went out and I drew up a series of, in the beginning, maybe like 8 or 10 rubber stamps, which were just like, my face looking forward or myself walking. And then I just, I started using this. Now I don't keep it every day. Sometimes it might be just once a week or something, but it's a very perfunctory way to make up like a diary strip. You just stamp them down, just write in. I try to keep it very unfussy. I don't worry about it. If I have to draw something, I will. Over the years, I've made more and more stamps, so I must have about 40 of them now, maybe more, I'm not sure. There's still always something that you're missing, but they become more and more minimal, just like my artwork. I think, like now, I look at this one we're looking at right now, and I think to myself, I don't like to draw a face looking at you like that anymore. It's like I'd rather just draw that as a silhouette. So I've had new ones made up where the figures are just dark shapes. So much of it's gotten more and more minimal, and somehow or other the minimalness of it actually, I think, is even better suited towards a diary, which is, not really about like, it's about the most basic form of comic storytelling because it's mostly interior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then once in that show, there were also a lot of reference materials, which are really fascinating to see because one can really make the connections to your work. And here is another look into a sketchbook. And one thing that I thought was interesting was that here in your exhibition, it was visible that you're also an artist in so many other fields that people who just know your books wouldn't even have dreamed of you doing, including like this wall. I think it was even, was it like a fabric-y kind of piece on the wall, if I remember correctly, or
yeah.
a large kind of mural almost? And
Absolutely.
three-dimensional objects. So maybe you could tell us a bit what drives you to try out other art forms? Because I mean, making books, making comics, to me,
Yeah.
the way at least you make it already fills a whole day and more. So something must drive you to other art forms and try them out as well, right?
Yeah, it's hard to say what why I'm doing it, because a lot of it never gets shown anywhere. Although it's always in my mind that this work exists, and it will go out into the world in some form eventually. Some of it is just for me. I mean, like you see that little bust of Wimbledon Green there. I'm not sure if you can see it in the room behind me here, but
yeah,
there
it is.
There is a bust up on the wall, because I'm in my library right now, and this is the Wimbledon Green Library. And so like I made certain objects just for this room, and much of the house is like that. A lot of this started because I moved into this house, and I wanted to really transform the house into my own environment. So that's what started to teach me the process of working with other craftspeople. Before that, I think like most cartoonists, I was used to doing everything on my own. The first time I needed somebody to do some work for me, like a carpenter or somebody to put in a floor, I started to realize like that you could just be a designer. Just let them do the work and you could design it. And that's led me into a whole process of working with like ceramic artists, working with carpenters, working with fabric artists, with metal workers. And it's allowed me to make a lot of stuff that I feel like everything, as I've gotten older, I think I feel not that I'm less of a cartoonist, it's that all these disciplines operate together to make one body of work. And I think now at this point, I'm almost 60, I'm 57 right now. I'm starting to think of my life as a body of work rather than individual works in the same way. Like I think when you start out, you think about like, you know, you're doing a comic book and then maybe you're doing a book. And each of these are very specific projects. And you don't really have the bigger view that you have when you get older. When you get older and you look back over your career, you recognize there's a trajectory to everything you're doing, that it's all the same in a certain way. When you're young, you don't realize how much you're going to keep doing the same things over and over again. I mean, when I was 25, I had like all kinds of books I was planning to write, and they were in a wide range of genres. And I didn't do any of those books. I just did book after book because they're all kind of the same thing. They're all about the same kind of world of memory. They're all about looking back. They're all kind of melancholy. Some of them might be a little funnier or a little more serious, but it's always the same. You keep going to the same well. And I think a lot of this work I'm working on, I just realized at a certain point, there are other ways to approach the same ideas. So instead of telling a story, you might make a physical object about it. Mm-hmm. Or you might, I sometimes, like a couple of years ago, I ended up collaborating with Mark Haney, who wrote a sort of a chamber music piece around the George Sprott book. And that was a really great experience to see someone transform the work into music. Yeah. At this point, I'm kind of open to anything because I just think it's so interesting to play around with other forms.
And even puppet theater, there was a beautiful small stage on display in the show where you created a whole set and puppets to go along with it. I'm just going to go through this a little faster because I want to use the time that we have left on our time slot here to quickly look at another show after this. But here we can see some of the ceramics that were on display at the show. So these, if I understand correctly, are just for yourself at the moment, right?
Yeah, to some degree. It's funny that things end up going out into the world. Like you don't plan it necessarily. Like this particular work you're looking at right now ended up leading to a curator coming to me and asking me to do like a bronze sculptural installation, full size. So I'm doing like a living room like this, made out of bronze that will be out in the real world. And certainly that was never in my plans. Oh, yeah. This was just a little project for myself. So it's funny how, you know, things lead to other things. So I do kind of look at it like it's for me, but you never know where it's going to end up or what it's about.
Yeah. And there are some interesting resemblance also in the three-dimensional work you did, and then the more two-dimensional, more abstract work, including some work you did for the Comic-Salons Erlangen, where they asked artists to contribute work, reflecting on the times that we're in, the pandemic times, the times where the world out there is empty. I'm just going to go through this quickly because I briefly would like to have one look at another exhibition that last year was very important for Canadian comics and that we would have liked to show in Germany this year at the Comic-Salons Erlangen, where I would have been in charge of coordinating the Canadian program, and we would have liked to bring over a number of artists and the curators. Your work was also on display in this show, which was the largest show, museum exhibition on Canadian comics ever, if I understand correctly, with almost 50 creators.
Absolutely, yeah. That was an impressive show.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, what was your impression? What was, I mean, it showed work of yours, work of Chester Brown, work of Julie Doucet, and a few other people who have been sort of contemporaries of yours, but then also a lot of younger artists. So when you look at Canadian comics nowadays, what are the most interesting developments or artists that you see at the moment?
Yeah, well, I'd say the most interesting thing that's gone on in comics in Canada is the younger artists. I mean, the interesting thing is, like, when I started out, Chester Brown and I were really like the only two cartoonists in Toronto, like, that were doing the kind of work we were doing. I mean, there were some other underground cartoonists here and there, but I certainly felt like that we were alone. I mean, there were other cartoonists in Canada. There was Julie Doucet, and Quebec had its own scene. But now in Toronto or in Quebec or in British Columbia, there's like a tremendous number of young, exciting cartoonists. And I think that proliferation of the art form is what I'm most gratified by. Because, you know, in the 80s, when I started working in alternative comics or underground comics, whatever you want to call it, it was very obscure. And I felt very connected to the American cartoonists, like people like Dan Clowes or Peter Bagg, Jaime Hernandez, Gilbert Hernandez. I felt like these were our peers, and I felt like there was just a couple of us up in Canada, and I think that they just thought of us as Americans. There didn't seem like there was going to be any grassroots growth of cartooning in Canada. In fact, by the year 2000, it really looked like the underground cartooning in general was dying. The publishers were in trouble in North America. And I can remember Chester Brown and I were sitting down and we were talking about our future. And we didn't really think there was going to be much of a future. And we were starting to think we might have to start making mini comics, or that, you know, it would look like it was coming to an end. Yeah. Something happened around that time. And I still don't fully understand exactly what happened. But there was a cultural shift where the graphic novel sort of took off. And at that point, I think I saw in the next 10 years, a large number of young cartoonists come up, very exciting cartoonists, people like Michael DeForge, people like Julian Tamaki, Jesse Jacobs. You know, there must be at least, I could probably list 10 or 15 people who are now probably in their 30s, I guess, or maybe the early 30s. Yeah. Just starting out then. And that was a really exciting group of cartoonists. I mean, there was few and far between before them. Now I feel like there's 100 more cartoonists. I don't even know their names. So yeah, that's really exciting.
And we would have liked to invite a number of these other younger cartoonists to Germany this year, as I mentioned before. But at least we have some of their work that people in Germany can also discover a little more in detail if they like to. With the support of the Canada Council of the Arts and the Canadian Embassy in Germany, the Comic-Salons Erlangen produced a newspaper-style publication that has a number of beautiful work. You mentioned Jesse Jacobs. He's in here, Ian Tamaki, Michael DeForge. They all contributed strips and work of theirs, partly exclusive to this publication. There is
I love that publication.
Generously contributed, which I think got published about 10 years ago in another publication. Interviews with artists, including yourself, and photos and background stories. So whoever is interested in Canadian comics can order a comics newspaper at canada@comic-salon.de, and it will be sent to you for free. So this was just a little commercial break, and
they should order it though. Definitely, it's a beautiful publication. I was so excited when I got it. I love a big newspaper, and it's beautifully printed, and it's very impressive. So definitely order one.
Good, yeah. I'm glad you liked it, and at one point, hopefully, we can also come up with an English version, because at this point it's only in German, but who knows, maybe sooner or later an English version is possible. But we are going to offer a lot of English programming at the Comic-Salons website this summer for the next few days and weeks, starting July 10th at CSE Digital. There will be many more interviews and much more programming. And I hope that sooner or later we can meet in person again when this whole situation is over. But let me thank you very much for your time, and I hope you're going to be okay for the future in Canada for now.
Well, fingers crossed for the future of the world, but hopefully, you know, we'll get back to a more normal world in some time in the future. And I would love to come and visit the festival. I would love to see you.
The invitation is still open. We will have you here sooner or later, I promise.
Okay, well, I'll be there. I'll see you.